The radar screen screamed, but no one could see the target. Deep inside a Soviet Air Defense Command bunker in Irkutsk, operators stared in disbelief as a white streak blinked across the display. It was moving too fast. Much too fast. Faster than anything they'd ever tracked. Faster than their missiles. Faster than thought. One technician shouted, "Unidentified Mach." 3 altitude 25,000. Then it vanished. The Soviet colonel on duty leaned forward. "Where is it now?" he barked. The reply came back, strained and quiet. "It's already gone." On September 4th, 1982, in the still air above Siberia, a shape black as midnight had sliced across the stratosphere. No lights, no escort, just heat, speed, and silence. It had entered Soviet airspace at over 3,500 kilometers per hour, flying at an altitude no MiG could reach. The ground-based radar barely had time to register its presence before the contact slipped off the screen. There had been no warning, no scramble, no defense. The officers watched the empty screen in a haze of disbelief. They had been tracking NATO bombers for decades. They knew the American playbook B-52s lumbering in from the Arctic, U-2s creeping at the edge of radar range. But this was something new. The colonel demanded a lock-on report. None was available. Not a single surface-to-air battery had acquired targeting solution. Not one MiG pilot had seen the intruder. And yet, it had crossed nearly 1,500 kilometers of Soviet territory. At Mach 3. No one knew what it was. No one knew how to stop it. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, the American had already landed, miles away, safe, untouchable. That aircraft was the SR-71 Blackbird, America's darkest shadow, designed not just to outrun Soviet missiles, but to render them obsolete. It wasn't just a spy plane. It was a declaration, a weapon of knowledge, a machine so fast, so high, so unreachable, that it turned entire doctrines into dust. And in that brief moment over Siberia, the Soviet air defense system, the largest, most complex in the world, realized it had seen the future, and the future couldn't be caught. They had spent decades building a wall in the sky. From Leningrad to Vladivostok, the Soviet Union had constructed the densest, most comprehensive air defense network in human history. Thousands of radar installations, dozens of interceptor bases, hundreds of SAM sites ringed every major city and military installation. It was a doctrine born from fear and pride. Fear of American bombers annihilating Moscow in minutes. Pride in a system that could catch them before they crossed the border. Soviet military planners believed their sky was sealed. Nothing entered undetected. Nothing left unchallenged. From World War II forward, their entire concept of defense rested on one assumption. Air supremacy was not optional. It was existential. They had shot down U-2s. They had threatened B-52s. They had chased every Western incursion from the Arctic ice to the Caspian coast. Every radar post, every interceptor, every SAM crew was a brick in a fortress of certainty. But certainty is a dangerous thing when the SR-71 first appeared on their screens. It didn't behave like an aircraft. It didn't cruise. It didn't loiter. It didn't descend. It slashed across the radar like a meteor. And then it vanished. For decades. Soviet engineers had calculated interceptor flight paths, missile lock times, radar response cycles, all based on known speeds, known altitudes, known threats. The fastest American plane they'd faced. The F-111 flew at Mach 2 for brief bursts, and even that strained their systems. But this flew at Mach 3.2, for hours, above 80,000 feet. Their radar stations tried to track it. But the sweep refresh couldn't keep up. By the time a missile battery was ready to fire, the target was already gone, out of range, untouchable. Their doctrine had no answer, because their doctrine assumed everything could be tracked, everything could be intercepted. That speed had a ceiling, that altitude had a maximum, that if you pointed a radar long enough, it would lock. They had never planned for something that broke those rules, that flew beyond them, literally. One officer, reviewing the incident afterward, muttered it wasn't a plane, it was a ghost, but it wasn't. It was real, and it was American. And it had just shattered the Soviet idea of control. Since the dawn of the jet age, Soviet air defense doctrine had been brutally simple: detect, track, destroy. Everything else was theory. This model had served them well against American U-2s, NATO reconnaissance flights, and the lumbering nuclear bombers of Strategic Air Command. The logic was layered, hierarchical, and terrifyingly efficient. Step 1, long-range early warning radars like the SR-71 or P-14 would detect the target over the horizon. Step 2, mid-range systems such as the S-75 Divina SA-2 would acquire and lock. Step 3, fighter interceptors like the MiG-25 Foxbat or the Su-15 would engage at altitude. Each layer reinforced the next. Each assumed the target could be followed, if not intercepted. But the SR-71 didn't follow the plan. Flying at altitudes above 25,000 meters, well beyond most missile systems' engagement ceilings, the Blackbird moved too fast for radar to lock, too high for fighters to intercept, and too quickly for command to respond. In real time, Soviet radar crews discovered a fatal truth by the time a missile site received coordinates. The aircraft was already 40 kilometers past them. Speed was its shield, height was its sword, and Soviet doctrine grounded in interception suddenly felt obsolete. Worse still, the SR-71 wasn't armed. It carried no bombs. It didn't need them. It gathered intelligence impossibly detailed, multi-spectrum, high-resolution intelligence. Every pass over Soviet soil peeled away secrets at 3,500 kilometers per hour. Missile installations, troop deployments, radar frequencies, it saw everything. And they couldn't touch it? No amount of doctrine, training, or patriotism could change the math. A MiG-25 might reach Mach 2.8, but only for a few minutes, risking engine failure. The SR-71 cruised above Mach 3 for hours. It was a plane built not to fight, but to outrun the fight entirely. For the Soviet generals, the implications were nightmarish. If the Americans had already fielded this, what came next? Was there an SR-72 a Mach 5 replacement, or worse, a strike version? Their entire strategic outlook hinged on control of their own skies. Now, one aircraft had crossed those skies with impunity, and the doctrine that once promised safety now felt like a lie. The first confirmed overflight occurred at dawn, somewhere over the Sea of Okhotsk. A Soviet early warning post picked up a contact streaking toward the mainland at incomprehensible velocity. It wasn't the trajectory of a ballistic missile, nor the profile of a satellite. It was low enough to be atmospheric, but far too fast for a conventional aircraft, and the station commander, uncertain, called for an escalation. Within seconds, radar sites across eastern Siberia scrambled to fix the target. The P-14 Tall King VHF radar caught a trace just long enough to confirm Mach 3.1. The next sweep missed it. It was already beyond the horizon. SAM sites prepped for intercept. S-75 batteries spun into readiness. Their missiles, the same ones that had brought down Gary Power's U-2 in 1960, now faced something even higher, even faster. Operators locked on. But the signal drifted. The target wasn't flying level. It was maneuvering, changing altitude slightly, banking just enough to confuse the tracking logic. The radar broke lock. Missile computers failed to acquire, again. The order to fire never came. In the skies above, the SR-71 banked gently westward, sensors running, cameras clicking 3,000 frames per minute. It wasn't hiding. It didn't jam signals. It didn't fire. It simply flew. Invisible not because it was stealthy, but because it was gone before the Soviets could react. Back on the ground, a MiG-25 scrambled. It climbed hard, engines screaming past redline, chasing a ghost across the upper atmosphere. The pilot caught a blip on his primitive radar, but it blurred, faded, vanished. His jet shuddered, altitude limit reached, fuel burning fast. Control tower ordered a return, target lost, and the overflight continued. In that moment, Soviet air defense officers faced something they had never encountered before, a threat that couldn't be stopped. Not through firepower, not through numbers, not through proximity. The SR-71 didn't need to be invisible. It just needed to be untouchable. And it was, when the after-action reports from Siberia reached the Ministry of Defense, disbelief outweighed concern. They had tracked a target flying at Mach 3.2 at 82,000 feet. It had entered and exited Soviet airspace unchallenged. Multiple radar stations confirmed it. Interceptor pilots corroborated it. SAM sites logged failed lock attempts. But to the generals in Moscow, it was unacceptable. Not unacceptable as a threat, unacceptable as a reality. Marshal Dmitry Ustinov, Minister of Defense, reviewed the files in silence. "There is no such aircraft," he said finally. "American propaganda." We would have known. The Soviet Union prided itself on its intelligence apparatus. The GRU, KGB, and military reconnaissance had long believed they could track the development of any new American strategic system. They had photos of every U.S. airbase, satellite images of hangars, launch pads, test ranges. Yet this Blackbird had appeared out of nowhere. They combed satellite photos of Groom Lake, Beale AFB, Palmdale. They saw strange buildings, long runways, infrared heat signatures, but no clear aircraft. It didn't matter if they hadn't seen it. It wasn't real. So they blamed operator error. The overflight was reclassified as an atmospheric anomaly, perhaps a weather balloon caught in an upper jet stream, or a misreading caused by software errors in the P-14 systems. A few officers suggested an experimental cruise missile test. Anything but the truth. Because the truth meant the Americans had out-engineered the Soviet military establishment again, and that was politically impossible. The Blackbird had not only violated Soviet airspace, it had violated Soviet belief. Their entire defense doctrine was predicated on reaction time, radar superiority, and layered denial. But this aircraft flew beyond all three. Accepting its existence would mean accepting vulnerability, and the USSR could not afford to admit, even internally, that it was defenseless. So they buried it. Officially. The incident never happened. Unofficially. Scramble procedures were updated, altitude thresholds revised. A secret directive ordered MiG-25 pilots to train at higher ceilings, even if it meant engine burnout. But the silence in Moscow spoke louder than any interception order. They had seen something they couldn't explain, and rather than confront it, they erased it. With the generals refusing to accept the truth, Soviet analysts scrambled to make sense of the impossible. If it wasn't a Mach 3 spy plane, then what was it? One theory began to circulate quietly among the Air Defense Command. The Americans had developed a new class of electronic warfare aircraft, something that didn't fly faster, but looked like it did, something that could spoof radar, confuse tracking systems, manipulate velocity readings, an illusion, not an incursion. Analysts from the radio technical forces proposed that the blip seen over Siberia might have been a signal ghost, an artificial signature, generated by a high-altitude jammer aircraft flying far outside the radar's cone of certainty. Perhaps an EC-135 or a drone, or something else entirely. This theory gained traction for one reason: it was comforting. It allowed Soviet leadership to maintain the belief that their systems were sound, that the intrusion had been deception, not defeat, that it was a trick, not a breakthrough. And so efforts intensified not to build faster planes, but to build stronger radars, smarter filters, better anti-jamming protocols. Resources poured into electromagnetic countermeasures. Radar engineers were ordered to recalibrate sweep algorithms. New software was rushed to field units, designed to detect phantom targets. But the SR-71 wasn't a phantom. It was real. And while Soviet scientists chased shadows on their screens, the Blackbird continued its missions, snapping photos of missile sites, tracking submarine movements, logging frequencies, and confirming satellite intelligence in real time. Each overflight drove the wrong theory deeper, because the truth was too disruptive. The Soviet military had trained its operators to fear jamming, spoofing, American electronics. They could fight that. But a machine that simply outran physics, that outflew the very idea of interception, that wasn't just threatening, it was paradigm-breaking. The wrong theory endured for years, because it gave them something to solve, because it meant they hadn't already lost. While the radar engineers clung to the idea of deception, a second, darker theory emerged from within the higher ranks of Soviet military intelligence, a theory not of technology, but of strategy. According to this narrative, the object streaking across Soviet skies wasn't an aircraft at all. It was a test, a provocation, a rehearsal for a first strike. The Americans, they claimed, were probing air defenses, mapping Soviet response times, baiting radar locks. The SR-71, if it existed, wasn't just spying. It was drawing a dotted line through the heart of Soviet command structure, showing the path cruise missiles could follow, unhindered. This theory was driven by paranoia, but it wasn't unfounded. Since the early 1980s, U.S. military exercises had grown more aggressive. NATO had begun flying closer to Soviet borders. Able Archer 83 was around the corner. Washington's rhetoric under Reagan was escalating from containment to confrontation. So when a mysterious object screamed across Siberia with impunity, the old guard in Moscow didn't see a reconnaissance mission. They saw a dry run for World War III. Internal briefings were updated. Commanders were ordered to recalibrate launch-on-warning thresholds. Radio silence drills were enforced across SAM divisions. Radar crews began logging not just detections, but how long it took them to react, because the implication was chilling if the Americans could send an aircraft at Mach 3.2. What could they send next? Could the SR-71 be used to deliver a nuclear warhead? Was it fast enough to strike command bunkers before retaliation could be ordered? What if this wasn't surveillance, but conditioning? This theory triggered a wave of overcorrection. Soviet air defense went into a permanent state of agitation. Readiness levels were raised. Border incidents increased. Every radar glitch became a possible threat. Every unidentified contact, a potential missile. And in doing so, the Soviet Union fell into a trap of its own making. By interpreting the SR-71 as a weapon, not a watcher, they poured resources into the wrong counters: faster missiles, faster interceptors, faster launch chains. But they missed the deeper truth. The Blackbird didn't win by flying faster. It won by not needing to fight at all. It gathered data, it revealed gaps, it made doctrine obsolete. And the more the Soviets feared it, the more they misread its purpose. The second wrong theory didn't just fail to stop the SR-71, it accelerated the very panic the aircraft was designed to exploit. In the heart of Soviet military intelligence, the GRU headquarters in Moscow, there was growing unease. Not because they knew what the SR-71 was, but because they didn't. No source had infiltrated Lockheed's skunk works. No satellite image had captured a definitive shape. No informant had offered a credible schematic. The Americans had done something the Soviets considered impossible in the nuclear era. They had built a strategic weapons platform entirely in the dark. The GRU had been blindsided. After decades of monitoring every American aerospace project, X-planes, high-altitude jets, even prototype drones, this aircraft had appeared and operated before anyone even realized it existed. The KGB's Directorate, T, responsible for technical espionage, was no better prepared. Their agents in the U.S. aerospace sector had heard whispers of a black project, but dismissed them as disinformation. Some intercepted documents mentioned a senior Crown initiative, but they were vague, sanitized, buried behind budget codes and contractor shuffles. The real breakthrough had already happened in 1964, but the Soviets didn't know it until overflights had already begun. By then, it was too late. They didn't know the SR-71 ceiling. They didn't know its true top speed. They didn't even know how many existed. Each overflight was treated as a new incident. Each radar trace analyzed like an alien encounter. The aircraft had no known base of origin flights, began outside radar coverage, and ended just as mysteriously. The U.S. Air Force never acknowledged the missions, no contrails, no public statements. The SR-71 operated in intelligence invisibility, and that terrified the Kremlin more than its speed, because intelligence failure wasn't just about missing facts. It was about losing predictability. If America could fly over Soviet nuclear sites and the Soviets couldn't respond or even understand how it happened, then deterrence itself broke down. The Blackbird's true impact wasn't just in surveillance, it was in confusion. Each time it crossed Soviet skies, it fed data back to the U.S. Gauk, but it also planted uncertainty in the minds of Soviet commanders. What else did the Americans have? How much did they already know? And perhaps most dangerously, how much did the Soviets not know about themselves? The failure wasn't just tactical. It was epistemological. The SR-71 made them question the very idea that they understood the battlefield at all. The SR-71 Blackbird was not a fluke. It was not a single miracle aircraft. It was the spear point of an entire philosophy, a strategic doctrine, rooted not in brute force, but in outrunning failure. Where the Soviets had built walls, SAM belts, radar fences, layered interceptor zones, the Americans had built a blade, and they had started decades earlier. In the mid-1950s, the CIA's U-2 spy plane had revolutionized surveillance, flying high above Soviet air defenses. But after Francis Gary Powers was shot down in 1960, President Eisenhower swore no more slow targets. The next aircraft had to be fast enough to outrun not just planes, but history. Lockheed's Skunk Works team, led by Clarence Kelly Johnson, designed a platform that barely obeyed the laws of physics. It flew so high, its pilots wore pressure suits. Its titanium skin expanded in flight. Its engines, Pratt & Whitney J-58s, didn't just push air. They devoured it. At Mach 3.2, the SR-71 traveled faster than a bullet, and it did so for hours. But speed was just the beginning. The Blackbird's RCS radar cross-section was lower than any plane before it thanks to its chine fuselage and radar-absorbing black paint. Its sensors captured real-time photos sharper than satellite images. Its ECM electronic countermeasures suite could spoof, jam, confuse, and disappear. But most of the time it didn't need to, because the true American system wasn't just the plane, It was the strategy behind it. Each SR-71 mission was planned down to the second entry vectors, exit corridors, satellite handoffs, AWACS backup, tanker rendezvous points. The U.S. Air Force treated every overflight like a precision strike with zero margin for error. The plane was never armed. Its weapon was information. The U.S. used the SR-71 to confirm nuclear readiness in Soviet ICBM fields, to track Tu-95 bomber dispersals, to monitor Chinese nuclear tests, to photograph Middle Eastern battlefields within hours of conflict. In 1982 over Lebanon, it photographed Syrian air defenses in one pass, allowing Israel to destroy them days later. In Korea, it flew within 30 kilometers of North Korean airspace and saw everything. In the Arctic, it tracked Soviet submarine movements through melt lines and sea ice. Every time it flew, it gathered knowledge the Soviets could only guess at, and they couldn't stop it. They couldn't even see it in time. The Blackbird made the very idea of territorial sovereignty feel obsolete, because borders didn't matter if the plane crossed them faster than radar could respond. And worst of all, every time it flew, it showed the Soviets something terrifying, that the Americans were not only ahead in technology, they were ahead in doctrine. The most humiliating engagement didn't involve missiles, it involved silence. In 1986, an SR-71 launched from Kadena Air Base in Okinawa. Its flight plan took it over the Sea of Japan, near Vladivostok, then cut north over Siberia's eastern edge before turning back into the Arctic airspace toward Alaska. It was a legal flight path barely skirting the edge of Soviet borders, but it was also bait. Soviet radar tracked the aircraft entering the detection envelope at blinding speed. The duty officer at the 11th Air Defense Army ordered a full scramble. MiG-25s were airborne in minutes. Multiple S-200 missile batteries came to alert status. Command issued code red, but the pilots couldn't catch it. The missiles couldn't lock. The Blackbird flew its path, banked gracefully north, and left without a trace. The entire Soviet Far East air defense network, multiple regiments, hundreds of personnel, billions of rubles in the radar and missile systems was exposed in under 10 minutes, and not a single shot was fired. Not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. One MiG-25 pilot later confessed in a classified debrief, "I could see its contrail high above, like a scratch across the sky. But no matter what I did, it kept pulling away." Humiliation turned into frustration. Then paranoia. Commanders demanded answers. Radar logs were poured over, engineers were blamed, some officers were quietly transferred for performance inconsistency, a few MiG-25 squadrons were grounded for review. But the system had done everything right, and failed. This incident wasn't isolated. Throughout the late 1970s and early 80s, SR-71s flew near Soviet airspace dozens of times, sometimes just outside the border, sometimes right through it, always too fast to stop. Soviet crews began to dread the alert tone for high-speed target. It meant a test they couldn't pass, a challenge they couldn't meet. They called it the ghost. Some believed the aircraft had capabilities beyond human technology. Others whispered it was unmanned, or cloaked, or protected by some kind of radar diffusing field. None of that was true. The truth was worse. It was human. It was real. And it was designed to make them feel exactly what they were feeling, helpless. The SR-71 didn't destroy Soviet radar sites. It made them irrelevant. In every sense that mattered. That was more devastating than any bomb. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union still claimed it had the world's most impenetrable air defense network. But inside the Ministry of Defense, the illusion had already shattered. The SR-71 Blackbird had proven repeatedly that the vast dome of Soviet radar coverage, once seen as a steel curtain, was porous, slow, and outdated. And the pride of Soviet engineering, its surface-to-air missile belts and interceptor squadrons, had been rendered strategically irrelevant by a single aircraft flying faster than their ideas could catch up. And that wasn't just a technical failure. It was an ideological collapse. Soviet military doctrine was built on layered, centralized control, detect, analyze, authorize, respond. The idea was to prevent chaos, ensure that no action was taken without orders. But the SR-71 didn't give time for orders. It arrived, observed, and exited before the first call up the chain could be completed. That structure, so methodical, so rigid, became a weakness. In contrast, the American system had empowered a different approach: fast execution, decentralized support, and strategic reconnaissance as a form of deterrence. The Blackbird didn't carry weapons because it was the weapon. It delivered strategic imbalance, not with fire, but with knowing. Each pass over Soviet skies was a silent statement. We see you. We know what you hide, and you can't stop us. In response, the Soviet Union diverted billions of rubles to develop countermeasures. The MiG-31 Foxhound with its massive radar and high-speed intercept capability, the S-300 missile system with longer range and better tracking. But these systems arrived too late, and none were ever tested in actual intercepts against the SR-71, because by the time they were fielded, the Blackbird was already untouchable. In its wake, it left not destruction, but disillusionment. The entire Soviet air defense strategy had been shown to rest on assumptions that no longer held, that borders could be defended, that speed had limits, that deterrence required missiles. But the Blackbird had crossed borders, broken speed, and delivered deterrence without ever firing a shot. Inside the Kremlin, planners began questioning everything: how to allocate resources, how to defend a state from something it couldn't reach, couldn't touch, couldn't even prove existed in public. It was a quiet collapse. No walls fell. No cities burned. No battles raged. Just silence after something fast and black vanished into the sky. Again. And when the Soviet Union itself unraveled a few years later, its failure wasn't just economic or political. It was strategic. They had built a world to defend against what they thought war looked like. But the Americans had already moved on. Today, the SR-71 Blackbird no longer flies. Its engines have cooled. Its titanium skin sits in museums, resting under spotlights instead of stars. But its shadow still lingers. In Russia. Veterans of the old Soviet air defense forces still remember the alerts, the flashes on the screen, the red lines on the radar that couldn't be followed. They remember the orders to scramble, the desperate radio chatter, the helplessness, the silence. Some call it a phantom. Others call it a myth. But for those who watched it cross their skies, unstoppable, unreachable, it was a ghost. A black streak that broke more than the sound barrier. It broke confidence. Because the SR-71 didn't just fly over the Soviet Union, it flew through its assumptions, through its pride, through the illusion that any fortress, no matter how vast, could survive unchallenged in American hangars. Retired pilots still speak of the machine with awe, of skin temperatures hotter than fire, of cruising at the edge of space, of looking down at entire countries through lenses sharper than memory. They knew what they were doing. Every mission sent a message. We can see you. We can reach you. You can't stop us. And they never could. No SR-71 was ever shot down. No Blackbird was ever caught. Not once. The Cold War produced many terrifying weapons bombers, missiles, submarines, but only one aircraft flew so high and so fast that it forced a global superpower to admit their skies were not safe. Their systems were not enough. And sometimes, the deadliest thing in war is knowledge. The SR-71 wasn't just an airplane. It was the last ghost of a war that was never fought, but always feared.